Download this code from codegive.com, link in the description below. Debugging Linux applications remotely using Visual Studio is a powerful feature that allows developers to leverage the rich debugging capabilities of Visual Studio while working on applications hosted on a Linux server. This tutorial will guide you through the steps to set up and use remote debugging for Linux applications. Prerequisites. 1. Visual Studio. Ensure you have Visual Studio 2019 or later installed on your Windows machine. 2. Linux machine. Have access to a Linux machine, physical or virtual, where your application is running. 3. SSH access. Ensure you can SSH into the Linux machine. 4. C++ development workload. Make sure to install the desktop development with C++ workload in Visual Studio. 5. CMake tools. If you're using cmake, ensure cmake is installed on your Linux system. Step 1. Install the required packages on Linux. 1. Install GNU server. This is the GNU debugger server that allows remote debugging. Bash. sudo apt-get update. sudo apt-get install GNU server. 2. Install GDB. If it's not already installed, you need the GNU debugger. Bash. sudo apt-get install GDB. Step 2. Configure the Linux application for debugging. Compile your application with debug symbols. Use the G flag with G++ or GCC when compiling your application. Bash. G++ go my_app_my_app.cpp. Step 3. Start the GNU server on the Linux machine. SSH into your Linux machine and navigate to the directory where your compiled application resides. Start the GNU server with the following command. Bash. server 1234/my_app. Here, 1234 is the port number where GNU server will listen for connections. You can choose a different port if needed. Step 4. Configure Visual Studio for remote debugging. 1. Open Visual Studio and create or open your project. 2. Add a new configuration for remote debugging. Right-click on your project in Solution Explorer and choose Properties. Go to Configuration Properties-Debugging. Set the debugger to launch to Remote GDB Debugger. 3. Set Remote Debugger Properties. Remote GDB Debugger Server, specify the SSH connection string. Format, username at hostname, example user at 192.168.1.10. Port, set the port to match the one used in GNU server, example 1234. Working directory, set it to the remote working directory where your application is located. Step 5. Configure SSH in Visual Studio. 1. Enable SSH support in Visual Studio by going to Tools-Options-Cross-Platform-Connection Manager. 2. Add a new SSH connection to your Linux machine, specifying the host name, username, and authentication method, password or key. Step 6. Start debugging. 1. Set breakpoints in your code in Visual Studio where you want to debug. 2. Start debugging by clicking on Start Debugging, F5. 3. Visual Studio will connect to the GNU server running on the Linux machine, and you'll be able to debug your application just like you would for a local application. Example. Here is a simple example of a C++ application, my_app.cpp. CPP. Include iostream. Void buggy function. int *ptr equals null pr. stdcout *ptr, // this will cause a segmentation fault. Int main. stdcout starting application, std and l. Buggy function. Return 0. Compiling and running. 1. Compile with debug symbols. Bash. G++Go my_app_my_app.cpp. 2 Start server. Bash. Server 1234/my_app. 3 In Visual Studio, set breakpoints in buggy function and start the remote debugging session. Conclusion. Remote debugging in Visual Studio makes it easier to diagnose and resolve issues in Linux applications. By following the steps outlined in this tutorial, you can effectively debug your applications running on a Linux server while using the powerful tools available in Visual Studio. Additional tips. Ensure that your firewall settings allow traffic on the specified port. For larger projects, consider using cmake to manage your build system. Monitor performance using Visual Studio's diagnostics tools to identify bottlenecks in your code. With this setup, you should be well on your way to efficiently debugging your Linux applications using Visual Studio.